Sarah's footsteps echoed through the empty corridor as she made her way to the 5th floor of St. Mercy Hospital. As her luck would have it, the elevator had refused to go beyond the 4th floor, forcing her to take the stairs. She'd been working at St. Mercy for 3 years, but this was her first time covering a shift on the half-abandoned 5th floor, where a section was supposedly closed for renovations. The stairs were in that part of the building. The air felt heavy, tinged with the acrid smell of antiseptic and something else, something old and musty. Sarah's flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing peeling wallpaper and discarded medical equipment covered in a thick layer of dust. As she moved deeper into the ward to get through to the other side, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. And from somewhere in the dark, she heard a clink. "Hello," she called out, her voice swallowed by the oppressive silence. But no one else should be up here. And as expected, there was no response. Probably the wind had merely pushed along a piece of debris. She was alone up here, or so she thought. As Sarah rounded a corner, a faint sound caught her attention. Beep, beep, beep. It was barely audible, but unmistakable. The rhythmic tone of a heart monitor. Impossible, she thought. None of the rooms on this side of the floor are in use, and the electricity has been turned off. She tried to rationalize it. Maybe she had misjudged and she was closer to the central foyer than she thought. Perhaps the sound was coming from the reception desk. But as she sped up, eager to be out in the light, the beeping grew louder, more insistent, closer. Although one part of her was beginning to panic, curiosity and professionalism overrode her apprehension as she followed the sound to a closed door. The nameplate read Room 512. Sarah's hand trembled as she reached for the handle. The door creaked open, revealing a room that looked like it had been frozen in time. Unlike the dusty corridor, this room was immaculate. The sheets on the bed were crisp and white, and the heart monitor beside it blinked steadily, its screen displaying vitals for a patient who wasn't there. Sarah approached, her mind racing. How can there be a patient staying on this side of the building? How was this machine even functioning? She checked the power cord. It wasn't plugged in, yet the monitor continued its steady rhythm, the green line jumping with each imaginary heartbeat. Before she could fully process what she was seeing, the room temperature plummeted. Sarah's breath came out in visible puffs, and goosebumps erupted along her arms. The monitor's beeping spiked rapidly, competing against her own hammering heartbeat, and before her eyes, an indentation formed on the bed, as if an invisible body had just laid down. Sarah let out a strangled cry, her knees nearly buckling beneath her. In response, the lights in the room flickered to life, revealing walls covered in outdated medical charts and x-rays. But what made Sarah's blood run cold were the restraints attached to the bed, old leather straps that looked well used and worn. They began to move on their own, tightening around invisible wrists and ankles. A whisper, barely audible, filled the room. "Help us!" Sarah stumbled backward, her back hitting the door. As she fumbled for the handle, she caught movement in her peripheral vision. The x-rays on the wall were changing, displaying grotesque deformities and unnatural anatomies that shifted and writhed within their frames. A skull x-ray turned to face her, its jaw opening in a silent scream. She burst into the hallway, heart pounding. But the corridor had changed. Gone was the abandoned, dusty passage. Instead, Sarah found herself in a bustling ward that looked straight out of the 1950s. Nurses in old-fashioned uniforms rushed past her, pushing gurneys with moaning patients. The air was thick with the smell of ether and the sound of agonized screams. One of the nurses stopped abruptly, staring at Sarah with milky, unseeing eyes. "You don't belong here," she hissed, her voice distorted as if coming through ancient speakers. "But now that you've seen us, you can't leave." Panic gripped Sarah as she sprinted down the corridor, trying to find a way out. But each turn only led her deeper into the nightmare, where space was spiraling out of control. The end of the corridor warped into a room, and she came face to face with a soldier with gangrenous wounds, his flesh rotting before her eyes. Then a child withered by polio, trapped in an iron lung that wheezed and groaned. A woman whose body seemed to be dissolving from within, her skin bubbling and peeling away to reveal pulsating organs beneath. As she spun and ran, No longer aware of any direction save the need to escape, snippets of conversations and screams echoed around her. The radiation will cure you, trust me. Hold her down, tighten the belts. It's just a little shock therapy. We need more subjects for the trials. Sarah realized with growing horror that she was witnessing the dark history of medicine. Every unethical experiment, every misguided treatment, every life lost to the pursuit of progress. The walls themselves seemed to weep, stained with the suffering of countless souls. She finally reached a stairwell. Relieved, she yanked open the door, only to find that it led to an operating theater. A group of doctors huddled around a patient on the table, their faces hidden behind blood-splattered masks. They turned to Sarah in unison, their eyes glowing with an otherworldly light. "Ah, our newest resident," one of them said, his voice gurgling as if speaking through fluid. "We've been expecting you. It's time for your first lesson." Sarah tried to run again, but invisible hands gripped her arms, pulling her towards the operating table. The patient there began to stir, sitting up to reveal a horrifically mangled body. It reached out to Sarah with a decaying hand. "Please," it croaked, "make it stop." In that moment of terror, Sarah's mind cleared. She remembered her training, her oath to do no harm. These souls, trapped in endless agony, needed help, not fear. She took a deep breath, steeling herself against the horror surrounding her. If running wasn't going to get her anywhere, she had to try something else. I want to understand," Sarah said, her voice shaking but determined. "What happened here? How can I help you?" The scene around her flickered, and suddenly she was in a vast, ethereal space. Ghostly figures surrounded her, patients, doctors, and nurses from across the centuries. Their forms were translucent, shifting between states of health and grotesque injury. An elderly doctor stepped forward, his form more solid than the others. "We are the mistakes of medical history," he explained, his voice heavy with regret. "Souls trapped between life and death, bound to this hospital by the unethical actions of those who swore to heal. Each of us represents a dark chapter in the evolution of medicine. Failed experiments, misguided theories, and cruel practices thought to be cutting edge." "But why have you brought me here?" Sarah asked, her fear giving way to a mix of compassion and professional curiosity. "Because you can see us," a young nurse replied, her spectral form bearing the marks of a brutal surgical procedure. "You have the gift and the compassion to help us move on. We've been waiting for someone like you, someone who can bear witness to our stories and learn from our suffering." Sarah spent what felt like hours listening to their stories, bearing witness to centuries of medical missteps and cruelties. A man from the 18th century described the agony of surgery without anesthesia. A woman from the early 20th century recounted her slow death from radium poisoning, prescribed as a cure-all. A child from the 1950s told of experimental treatments that had caused more harm than good. With each tale, the apparitions seemed to grow more at peace, their forms becoming less twisted and pained. Sarah realized that by acknowledging their experiences, by promising to learn from their suffering, she was helping to heal wounds that had festered for decades, even centuries. As the last spirit faded, the elderly doctor turned to Sarah. "Thank you for listening, for understanding, but be warned. The boundary between your world and ours has been weakened. Others may try to cross over, to use the living to continue their work. You must be vigilant." He placed a spectral hand on her forehead, and suddenly Sarah's mind was flooded with medical knowledge from across time. Treatments both revolutionary and horrific, the triumphs and tragedies of healthcare's evolution. "Use this wisdom wisely," the doctor said. "Learn from our mistakes and help guide the future of medicine towards compassion and true healing." With a gasp, Sarah found herself back in the dusty, abandoned corridor of the 5th floor. Sunlight streamed through a nearby window. She had been there all night. Her phone buzzed with worried messages from the hospital staff, wondering why she hadn't checked in. As Sarah made her way downstairs on shaky legs, she knew her life had changed forever. The 5th floor's renovation would never happen. She would make sure of that. That ward would remain sealed, a memorial to those who had suffered in the name of medicine. But the doctor's warning echoed in her mind. Sarah realized her journey had only just begun. She was now a guardian, protecting the boundary between the world of the living and the restless spirits of medical history. And she had been given a profound responsibility to use the knowledge gained from centuries of trial and error to push medicine forward, always remembering the human cost of progress. In the days and weeks that followed, Sarah threw herself into her work with renewed passion. She advocated for patient rights, questioned outdated procedures, and pushed for more ethical research practices. Her colleagues were baffled by her sudden expertise and insight, but they couldn't argue with the results. Patient outcomes had improved. But at night, when the hospital quieted and the shadows grew long, Sarah would sometimes hear the faint beep of a phantom heart monitor, or catch a glimpse of a figure in an old-fashioned nurse's uniform disappearing around a corner. The spirits were still there, watching, waiting, a constant reminder of the weight of her newfound responsibility. As she walked through the hospital corridors, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that the very walls were alive with untold stories. Every medical instrument, every patient chart seemed to whisper of past triumphs and tragedies. She knew that her experience on the 5th floor had given her a unique perspective, one that bridged the gap between medical science and the deeply human experience of illness and healing. Sarah began keeping a journal, documenting not just her day-to-day experiences, but also the whispered tales and visions that came to her in quiet moments. She wrote of forgotten cures lost to time, of the emotional toll of caregiving across centuries, and of the delicate balance between innovation and ethics in medicine. As weeks turned to months, Sarah's reputation grew. Patients requested her by name, drawn to her empathetic approach and seemingly intuitive understanding of their conditions and openness to explore cures beyond modern medicine. Fellow nurses and even doctors began to seek her advice, sensing that she possessed knowledge beyond her years and experience. But with her growing influence came new challenges. Sarah began to notice subtle changes in the hospital, equipment that seemed to malfunction in specific ways, patient symptoms that defied modern explanation. She realized that the barrier between the world of the living and the phantom ward was thinning, allowing echoes of past medical horrors to bleed through. The others, that doctor had warned her about them. One night, as she was finishing her rounds, Sarah heard a commotion from a patient's room. She rushed in to find the monitors going haywire and the patient thrashing in his bed, muttering in a language she didn't understand. But as she approached, she saw not just the patient, but a ghostly overlay of a man in 19th century clothing, his form riddled with the marks of an antiquated disease. Drawing on the knowledge imparted to her by the spirits, Sarah began to treat not just the physical symptoms, but the spectral illness as well. Her hands moved with certainty, combining modern techniques with long-forgotten remedies. As the patient calmed and his vitals stabilized, the ghostly figure nodded to her in gratitude before fading away. Sarah realized then that her role was greater than she had imagined. She wasn't just a guardian of the boundary between worlds, she was a bridge, a healer who could draw upon the collective knowledge of medical history to face the challenges of the present and future. As she stepped out of the hospital into the bright morning light, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that eyes were watching her from the darkened 5th floor windows. The phantom ward had chosen her, and its stories and horrors would be with her forever. But now those stories were a source of strength and wisdom, guiding her as she worked to reshape the very foundations of medical care. Sarah took a deep breath, squaring her shoulders as she prepared to face another day. The weight of centuries of medical knowledge pressed upon her, a constant reminder of the responsibility she bore. But with it came a sense of purpose, a deep understanding that her unique gift could help prevent the mistakes of the past from repeating in the future. As she walked back into St. Mercy, Sarah silently renewed her vow to honor the suffering of those who came before, to heal with compassion and wisdom, and to stand guard against the darker impulses that had once plagued the medical profession. The phantom ward had revealed to her the true meaning of her calling, and she was determined to live up to it, no matter the cost.